So we'll get started there. Thanks everyone for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Today's session is our regular Life Sciences Legal Forum, and we'll be looking at reputation management for life sciences organisations. We're excited to be joined today by Lynne Trowbridge and Janet Morgan. Lynne is a highly regarded communications executive with 25 years of experience or more in the life sciences sector. And Janet is a corporate communications professional with very extensive experience working with pharma, health, and life sciences organisations. They both now together work with their agency Bridgemore, working with UK and global organisations, helping leaders and teams to achieve business objectives through integrated strategic marketing, communications, and proactive reputation management. And then from Mills and Reeve today, we have James Fry, our head of life sciences practice. James works with large and small life sciences organizations on their strategic objectives and commercial relationships. And then we have Mark Davison with us, who is an experienced dispute resolution specialist. And Mark is used to managing and resolving conflicts and disputes with the minimum of fuss. So what we are planning to do, we're going to go through some introductory comments and case studies. We would love you to raise questions as we go using the Q&A function, if you would, and we will answer those as we go to the extent we can, and then seek to obtain deal with any outstanding questions at the end. And if we run out of time, you can raise questions with us afterwards, and we'll give you our contact details. We're also recording the session so that you could catch up later or share it with a colleague if you want. So these are our panelists, and we're going to get going with the meat of the session now. So I would like to ask each panelist a question just to get a feel for the kinds of issues that they're seeing as important in this area of reputation management. So James, starting with you, could you say what kinds of reputational issues you find clients are facing at the moment? Do you find that they are well prepared to deal with those? What sort of things are they encountering currently?
Yeah, thanks, Isabel. As Isabel mentioned, I'm sort of a commercial and IP lawyer within the life sciences sector. So we're very much supporting clients as they go through the whole of the product life cycle, research, development, and out the other side into commercialization. I think I'd like to answer your first question first, actually, Isabel, in terms of whether our view is that most businesses are prepared. I don't think that is the case. I think sort of naturally people will probably revert to sort of dealing with issues as they arise. And hopefully one of the sort of take-home points from this is actually some early planning, some early thought around actually how you're going to manage a crisis that hits the business is well worth doing in order for you to be able to sort of proactively manage issues. So I think as a general view is that many of our clients are often quite surprised by the unexpected happening. In terms of those sort of big reputational threats and where they sort of stem from in this space, Isabel, I've probably got sort of 5. I mean, there are other areas, but I think in terms of those key areas, the first is regulatory risks, and I think that is sort of in many ways accentuated by the tightening of regulation within the sector, but also acknowledging that we are very much a global sector with global supply chains. So you're having to sort of manage reputational risk against quite a broad and complex landscape around regulation. So I think that's the first area. It's managing regulatory risks and risk and compliance. First issue, I sort of almost alluded to this, is around sort of supply chain disruption. So issues, and we'll get into this when I think we talk about some of the case studies, issues arising from engagement with third-party suppliers, some of whom may be absolutely key and fundamental to the further development of your products and programs, but also with partners. And all of this is obviously exacerbated by, again, the fact that we are a global sector and complex supply chains for life sciences organisations. So I think that's sort of the second headline issue. The third is around ethics and brand. So corruption, unethical behaviour, potentially by employees or within partners, but also looking at some of those broader contextual issues in terms of things like approach of the business to ESG. I mean, our last session we ran around ESG within the life sciences sector, so we looked at some of those issues, but actually defining and how you actually manage your approach around that. I think it goes to brand, it goes to reputation. The fourth area, I think, which is going to keep a number of execs concerned, will be around product safety and failures. A lot of those issues will drive a lot of things to be thought through. And again, we'll look at that when we get to one of the case studies. And then the final issue, I think, is around security, and particularly around information and data security, how the business deals with cyber threats, etc., privacy compliance and the like. So I think in terms of a headline, Isabel, those I think are the 5 issues that we would rank at the top in terms of driving sort of reputational risk.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great summary, James, of some of the issues that clients are facing. Lynne, I wonder if you could comment on what you feel are the main take-home messages for businesses in this sector.
I think from my perspective, the most important thing here is that you've got to be thinking about this sort of reputation management more globally. You think about it holistically. In order to manage a reputation, you have to build a reputation. And how you build that reputation and building that reputation throughout the growth cycle of the company, whatever stage you're at, is really, really important. And it goes very much hand in hand with, James was talking about the complexity of the environment which we work here. It's really tough to be building a reputation in a changing and challenging environment that we're currently in. And really making sure that you are thinking ahead as much as you possibly can. And a key part of that is really planning for those issues and concerns. I don't know if Janet would like to add to a few of those points.
I think the theme that you're going to hear over and over again is planning and preparation. Actually, James has mentioned it, Lynne has mentioned it, and I think it's very difficult to deal with a reputational crisis that lands on your doorstep with no notice. So,
and is there something around consistency as well?
Yes, I think that's a really key point, is that sort of communications and actually the other partners involved in thinking about what you as an organization wish to say need to be involved and all agree, working through what's that position going to be. Have you considered what you want your people to say, what you want your stakeholders to be aware of, and make sure that you're not giving different messages to different audiences that are conflicting. Obviously, you will emphasize different things because your different stakeholders may be interested in slightly different nuancing, but overall that message needs to be consistent.
Mark, can we turn to you? You tend to perhaps get involved when things start going wrong, but perhaps you could say something about what steps organizations can take to try and plan and protect their position.
Yes, I think just to sort of repeat what James and Lynne said and Janet said, from a litigator's perspective, I think I really have sort of 4 key takeaways, and the first one is the prepare early. I think James touched on, look, have you got a plan in place if something does go wrong, whether that be with a regulatory body or with a key counterparty? The plan isn't going to necessarily match what's actually happened, but having that plan in place will help you and will make sure that you're ahead of the game. For example, if there is a data breach, have you got a plan who you're going to contact if there is that particular issue to try and manage that crisis? I think it also actually just extends to if you've got a key supplier or a key counterparty, are you managing and reviewing that contract on a regular basis just to make sure that actually you're on top of any potential breach that you may be causing or which they may be causing, to try and solve that early before that escalates. The second sort of takeaway I have is that if something does go wrong, then do involve lawyers early. I know there's a hesitancy to try and sort of resolve the issue yourself, but we have this concept in England called legal privilege, which effectively provides sort of makes communications about a particular issue confidential. And unfortunately, if you get that wrong, then the sort of internal investigations which you're undertaking at the outset of an issue might actually become a disclosable document if there are sort of regulatory or court proceedings later on. And I think as part of that, the third key takeaway as well is that, you know, if something is escalating, do involve lawyers before you send any communications externally, whether that be an external press piece or communicating with the other side or your regulatory body. Again, just to make sure that there's nothing in that communication which will come back and harm you later. Lawyers, certainly as a litigator, we're well used to sort of helping clients sort of navigate the legal issues, but together with the broader commercial context to try and develop a strategy with you in order to try and meet the objectives that you're trying to achieve. And then the fourth takeaway I have is that, you know, if you've got a key counterparty or a key contract with a counterparty and you're concerned that if there is a dispute under that contract, and that might become a sort of public set of proceedings, one thing you might want to consider is what we call arbitration, which is effectively a private form of dispute resolution, which means that effectively that should not get into the public domain.
Yes, we're seeing that being increasingly popular now, aren't we, as a form of dispute resolution put into contracts from the outset.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yes, Isabel, can I just? I was going to say, can I pop in there? Which
yeah, please do, Janet.
Completely agree. Involve the lawyers early, involve communications early as well. I think it's, you know, when you're dealing with an issue, you might think you know everything about it, but there's probably a different perspective that each team is going to bring. From a comms function, our timeframes are frequently very urgent. You'll find us wanting to do things really quickly. That's the validity or the where the value of planning in advance has worked through. Because if you have a holding statement that you've agreed in advance, it doesn't commit you to anything, but at least acknowledges, yes, I am aware there is an issue, and it shows that you as an organization are doing something about it. In the process of developing those statements, we will have worked very closely with the lawyers. We'll have developed a relationship and a trust so that when the issue hits, actually that improves the working relationship as well. You both know what each of you needs to achieve, and you understand that you'll work collaboratively together to do what's best for the organization.
I think also, you know, it sounds quite daunting when we talk a lot about let's prepare, let's have a holding statement, etc. James went through, you know, 5 scenarios there, all of which have multiple facets to them. And when you first start to sit down and go, golly me, where do I start? It can be extremely daunting. And I think the key thing that we've got a lot of experience in is look at your business continuity management plan, pick a few scenarios, just work through preparing for a few, because they're a great test bed for giving that opportunity, for, as Janet said, for your comms team, for your business development, for management to all get to know each other and understand each other's issues, concerns and timeframes and needs, really, so that they're all, you know, you're a well-oiled team beforehand. And if you haven't prepared for that exact scenario, you're at least ready with something that's pretty close that you can then tweak, so you're not starting from scratch.
That's great. Thanks, everyone. Well, after those useful opening remarks, I think we should now move on to our first case study. And what I'd like to do is ask you, perhaps, James, if you could introduce the case study and then make some comments around how you see that playing out.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we've seen this kind of scenario quite a bit. So we're a biotech. Lead asset has been partnered exclusively with large pharma. Milestone payments, exit options at several stages of development, and then there's a failure of a pivotal trial due to adverse effects. Pharma partner wants to exit and hand back the asset. So yeah, obviously no milestone payment and no ongoing development partner for the lead asset, and so future of the product is really uncertain. I mean, before I hand over to colleagues, I just wanted to make some sort of overarching comments in terms of some of the preparatory steps on this, and probably four main comments to make, and there's obviously some sub points to make within that. So the first, although we've already alluded to it, do we have sort of a crisis management comms plan for this program? What does it say? I think the second thing is to think around information gathering, really to understand what has gone wrong. You're not going to want to go in half-baked on this particular issue with your comms. What information do you have or need to get? You need to understand the contractual position with your partner around exit, hand back, and also importantly in this context, obtaining information around the trial failure, because you as the biotech, as the licensor, are not going to have the contracts in place with the site, with the PI or the CRO. It's going to need to be through the partner. So there's going to need to be that kind of engagement. Is there any potential exposure under the partner agreement in relation to indemnities around the failure of the technology? If it's around the platform IP, so you really need to understand that detail, and also then think contextually: is there a broader impact beyond this program? Are there follow-on assets? So internal programs, other partner programs that are going to be impacted, particularly if using the same platform technology. And as Janet says, actually, are you able to use holding comms? I'm sure we'll get into that in a bit more detail. And then probably at the same time, because timelines could be defined around a lot of the things you then need to do, thinking around that stakeholder engagement. So who do you need to engage and communicate with? The partner will likely be the trial sponsor and will engage with the regulator. We haven't said where the trial is, but it could be anywhere. But are you able to be involved in that engagement with the regulator? The contract will define that. And then what are the comms will your partners need to make, and thinking around coordination around that. Partner is large pharma here and may not meet the materiality threshold. We'll assume that they are listed, but may not meet the materiality threshold in terms of for them to publicly announce. I'm assuming, because we're an SME, that we're not listed, but if we are, then we're likely to have to publicly announce because it will be materiality, it will go to value, and we need to understand when we're going to do that. And then it's thinking around, and Janice and Lynne will talk about this in more detail, around the comms internally and with other stakeholders, so investors, funders, other partners, other out-licensed partners. There may be obligations under other partnering agreements. Just really getting a sense of that contractual landscape, I think, is absolutely key. And understanding the timings for comms so that everything is then coordinated, because it will also influence your plan around things like information gathering. And then it's about developing your action and comms plan. And I think, as Mark will go into a bit more detail, then navigating all those twists and turns as you go into implementing. And perhaps I can bring in Lynne and Janet just to sort of talk in a bit more detail from a comms perspective.
Lynne, you happy for me to start on this one? Yeah. Thank you, Mark. I think that's absolutely spot on. I mean, it's plan, isn't it? I mean, back in the day when I was working on products at different stages at GSK, and we wouldn't know the result of a trial, we would plan for different scenarios. We would have written the draft press release. We would have written the Q&As behind it. with the team, by the way. This isn't just comms, this would be legal, this would be medical within that. So we were planning for the different scenarios, not knowing what the outcome was. That enabled us to have the conversations during that planning process to understand who might address which particular issue, which issues might come up, and also thinking through all of the stakeholders and who was responsible for communicating to those. Because when things are moving quickly, you really need to understand that you've ticked off all of those stakeholders and that people are responsible for leading on them. A couple other things to think through. I think that materiality piece is really interesting, Mark, that you mentioned. And again, I've been on both sides of the fence. I've been in the small biotech where it really meant a lot to us, but for the pharma, this announcement didn't mean very much at all. And they might have a different view of how you announce it. So Lynne, you and I were talking about this earlier, that it's quite important that you build relationships, not just from that biz dev or legal side on both partnerships, but also from a communications function, because what your partner's communication function might want out of an announcement might be very different from you and what that looks like. Lynne, do you want to build on that one?
Yeah, I think that the key sort of like shorthand we have here is it's a win-win. And I think it's understanding what is a win for all the parties involved in all this. Because you know, if you look at it on the face of how it's outlined here, it looks like, oh golly me, it's bad news. However, there could be some upside out of this in the future. And so, you know, things aren't always doom and gloom. And I think there can always be a good win for all parties in these scenarios if you've taken the time to think about and understand each other's requirements at the get-go. And it takes us back to that really sort of like boring word you'll hear over and again, which is the preparation planning, whichever way you want to call it. But I think then the other thing that James hit on, which is really, really crucial, is a comms plan. You know, these things, really making sure that everybody understands what they're doing when, because it's really, really, really important that things are done in the right order and in the right way. And so some things may have to be done separately, but at the same time. And so having a common frame of reference, a common Q&A, and you know, that really speaks to the issue from all the parties' perspectives. Because, you know, as Janet was saying, you know, within like a large pharma, you create your own Q&A. And often a small biotech hasn't got the time or the capability or the capacity to do that. And I think that's where, you know, thinking a little bit more about how do I invest my valuable resources to really, you know, take some time and prepare a good set of Q&As around all of these key programs that you're running. And I think that it's even more imperative if you know, we're talking here about an asset potentially that might have an impact on another asset you've partnered with another company. Yeah, if it's a platform technology, it could have an impact on the platform technology. And so really sort of like looking at, you know, holistically at what it is that this could mean, and really managing ahead for saying, look, this is this issue, however, this isn't going to impact this one or whatever, and being prepared to be able to convey a really clear and concise, uncomplicated story to all of your stakeholders, and really understand how those stakeholders take in their information and the terminology that they want to use. Because it's no good going out with a highly regulatory oriented announcement and messaging to say a more generalist investor, because they're just going to go, well, I don't understand what's going on here. So really be cognizant about how people receive your information. Mark.
I think just from a litigator's perspective as well, just touching on James's point before about you know, whether you need to make disclosures to, you know, to listing authorities if you're a listed entity. I think even if you're not a listed entity, but you've gone through various investment rounds as well, you'll need to check your sort of investment agreements as well as to what disclosures you need to make to investors. You're probably not going to go through a future investment round here. But if you do, then obviously this is going to be a matter which has to be disclosed on future investment rounds as well. I think just looking back at sort of, you know, the partner who has decided that actually they no longer want to sort of co-develop the product with you and want to sort of walk away from the agreement, then obviously you're going to have to look at you know, what contractual rights you have, whether there is anything which you need to enforce in order to try and save the business, or to sort of generate sort of revenue to sort of develop, whether it be this product or other technology that you are developing as well. And I think with that, I touched on before about involving lawyers early in terms of the internal investigation as to what has happened. But again, this is going to be key here, given that effectively there has been a failure of a pivotal trial. And you don't want to end up in a position where actually you decide that actually you've got a good claim against your partner, you commence proceedings, but ultimately you're going to have to then disclose the contents of that internal investigation which you undertook, because you structured it without lawyers, where you don't have the legal protection from being able to maintain privilege in those communications. And there's been various examples recently of where corporates have gone off and undertook internal investigations without structuring them correctly, and that sort of dirty linen has ended up being sort of presented in court, and various sort of newspapers have reported on that, which has been fairly embarrassing. I think just the other point as well, we've talked about the external comms from our side as well, but you know, it goes without saying, but just keep an eye on what external comms your partner is releasing as well, just in case there is anything which is potentially defamatory in there as well. Because again, if that's causing harm to you as a company, then there may be steps that you can take to try and sort of prevent, or at least try and limit the damage caused by the defamatory material.
Thank you. That's so interesting. I just wanted to, there's a question about what you were, Lynne and Janet, talking about around that working together before anything goes wrong. And if you have a small and large partner, I mean, the question sort of how have you found that to be successful, that getting engagement between the two of you from the comms function prior to anything going wrong? Because it, you know, doing it before rather than after is clearly going to be preferable.
And I think it's a great question, because this is the thing that both Janet and I are incredibly passionate about, because we've both been on both sides of the fence, and all sides of the fence in these scenarios. And the key thing here is that comms people really do like to talk to other comms people. You know, we have our own shorthand. We are able to sort of like cut through and explain really clearly what our needs are, because we understand what each other's sort of responsibilities are. And, you know, and being bought in, we're always passionate to be bought in as early as possible. And I've yet to meet a comms person in my career in any organization that says, I'm not interested in speaking to another comms party. Invariably, the roadblockers to that sort of like expert to expert engagement are people inside one or the other of the organizations who fail to recognize the importance of teams like legal, like comms at those key stages. Yeah.
Can I just make a
Janet,
point?
was there anything else you wanted to add? Oh, sorry, James.
I was just going to make a point. I mean, I'm often involved in license and partnering negotiations. So negotiating the deal between biotech and pharma. And actually, interestingly, you have these discussions during negotiation in terms of lining up the relevant teams. And comms is a stream there. But it's also thinking about it in the context of the contract, that you can put good governance measures in there, because I think a lot of this is also about getting early notice of potential issues as well. So is this going to be a complete surprise to you? Hopefully not. You have had some early engagement, so you're able to plan accordingly, because that's going to inform your pre-issue comms plan as well. And handback, I think, is absolutely key in terms of it's often you're thinking about these potential issues when you're negotiating the license contract, because commonly pharma will have the right to terminate on notice, or if there is a product safety issue, and so you will need to think about termination consequences, and that's dealing with things like sort of tech transfer. So you are getting IP technology back, so that there's that portability concept issue in terms of being able to use what has been developed potentially in another guise. It goes back to that sort of win-win point that Lynne was making.
Janet, did you have a thought on that?
Very similar in terms of, as James and Lynne have both said, that win-win piece. I think the thing to remember is that probably both comms and legal might have a different view of what's happening within their organization than somebody down in BD might, because or whoever is negotiating the alliance or within the alliance, that will be the most important thing to them, and very appropriate that it is. But often from a communications point of view, we will have a view that there's multiple other announcements or there's other examples, and so can understand where this fits in the big scheme of things. And it might, particularly if you're the big pharma, this might not be a big initiative for them. So there's an arrangement or an agreement between the other communications function about, or the other partner, how they want to position it. And generally, I mean, I've found most other comms professionals, as Lynne said, are adversarial on this. We want to come out with the best outcome for both of us. So it's what's the win-win.
And I think there's one other audience group, I think, that it's worth sort of like highlighting at this stage, because I think we've sort of like skipped over them, and that is your internal audience. Yeah, and in this sort of scenario here, you could absolutely see, oh golly me, you know, I'm a scientist working at said biotech SME, and I hear about this, and no one's told me internally what on earth's going on. Of course, I'm putting out my CV that day and searching for a new job. And you know, and that's the sort of scenario that you absolutely wish to avoid. And I think it's about just remembering, whilst you're thinking about the partner and you're thinking about your investors and you're thinking about all the other audience groups, remember that your internal staff are, one, your biggest advocates, but also they've got their finger on the pulse. They're also networked and connected with other people. And so they can be great, valuable source for understanding how things are going down within the industry and how things are being perceived, etc. So they're really useful to have a really good, strong two-way conversation with your internal team on a daily basis, if you like. But in this kind of scenario, you really have to think about proactively communicating internally. But remember, as Mark says, just make sure that you've got your legal team have had a good eye on it, because you've got to be really careful what you're saying. Make sure you tell them enough, but you know, there may be things that you have to hold back for whatever reason. Would you agree, Mark?
Yes. It's sort of one of the things that we advise clients when there is sort of crisis management issue which is happening, is effectively the smaller the team that you have to keep information within that small team, the better. So, you know, the idea of sort of telling your whole organization exactly what is happening, you lose control there as to, you know, they might inadvertently disclose it, you know, in conversations with friends. So just keep the key information internal within an agreed team. And you know, and that part of, you know, as James and Lynne, as you were saying about the early management of this, setting up a plan, you can effectively try and organize who is going to sit in that small crisis management team.
Thank you. That's been great. Really interesting analysis of this case study. So unless there's anything further on that one, let's move on to our second case study, slightly different scenario where we have an issue with an overseas API manufacturer. Once again, James, I wonder if I could invite you to take a first look at this and make some initial comments around it.
Yes, absolutely, Isabel. Very happy to. It's probably a similar methodology to case study one, but obviously the context is different here. You've got an issue with a key supplier, and I think one of the big issues here, which I know Mark is going to wrestle with a bit later on, is you've got a bit of a balance here, because how key is this API supplier? You may need ongoing supply of the API in order to continue to sort of drive forward your programs and product development. But then you've got a potential issue, you've got a legal issue, and actually how you balance that and manage that is going to be pretty tricky. But I think sort of stepping back from that, you've got information gathering. You need to understand really what has happened here. Mark will talk through sort of contractual legal remedies in a bit, but really you need to understand what is the contractual legal position, what does the manufacturing and supply agreement say. Hopefully it's not sort of back of a fag packet type contract, but you've got a number of issues to think through in terms of potential contract breaches, breach of confidentiality, intellectual property infringement. You've got the overseas dynamic here, which again, Mark is well versed to advising clients around all of that. But then thinking around potentially what mitigating steps can be taken. If you do terminate, then is there an alternative manufacturing source for you? How does this impact your regulatory filings? And we've seen this a number of times in terms of the API has changed, and you've got your filings on foot. You're going to need to think around the impact of those in terms of fresh filings, etc. Potential delays on your clinical programs as well. What is the impact on current and future plans, particularly if you are forced to terminate or if you're in a legal dispute with a key supplier? And as I've already said, sort of how does this impact your current programs? Potentially, you've got out license partners who are also dependent on this supply in some way as well. So that leads me to the third point, which we've already sort of talked about in the context of case study one, which is really understanding that stakeholder engagement. You've got the comms internally, just following on from the great point that Lynne just made, but also with other stakeholders. Mark talked about investors, talked about funders, and other partners. If you've got clinical programs on foot, then there's going to need to be engagement with the CRO, with your sites. As I said, some of our license partners may also be dependent on supply here. But you've got that really tricky balancing act here to play, and that context is all important, I think, in relation to managing this kind of really tricky issue. So it's about then developing your action plan, and as I said before, sort of navigating those twists and turns, which I don't think is going to be easy in the context of this case study. Shall I bring Mark in just to sort of maybe talk about that, and then we can go to Lynne and Janet just to talk around the comms piece.
Yeah, there's two reflections on that point, James. That the first one just touching a bit on the alternative manufacturers as well. It's quite an interesting point. I've seen a case before where effectively an API manufacturer has had to pull out of the market for a particular reason, and the way that effectively the entity handled it, with the way that they approached the alternative manufacturers, gave away the issue with the other manufacturer. And the alternative suppliers in the market effectively just increased the price on them. So their API was more expensive to supply, which obviously then had the knock-on impact in terms of the profitability on the product. I think just touching on this sort of scenario here, where you have an issue where the supplier is potentially going to breach the confidence and is effectively using your proprietary information. Certainly every agreement that I've ever seen you draft, James, has very robust and clear drafted confidentiality clauses, and most agreements in the sector will do to try and protect the proprietary information. What you're effectively going to have to try and do that is, how do you enforce and protect that proprietary information, given that here you've got a supplier in China, and you're going to have to look to so usually the way you would do it, if it was an entity in England, you'd be able to go and seek injunctive relief to restrain them from effectively misusing your proprietary information or from going public. But there is a dynamic here, given that your counterparty is in China, as to what steps you can take in China to try and protect your proprietary information. And that comes back to one of the points that I said at the start, that effectively the whole process from a litigator's perspective about sort of reputation management and crisis management starts at the very outset of the contract. And so you're going to have to look at what dispute resolution clause you have in your contract with your counterparty to see what is going to be the best way to effectively try and protect your proprietary information. If you've got something where it's courts in China, you may be able to, or a sort of an arbitration center where enforcement in China is relatively straightforward, you should be able to try and seek some form of attachment to restrain the use of the proprietary information. But if you've got effectively an exclusive jurisdiction clause in England, then you may struggle. So again, it's just thinking through, I think as Lynne and Janet touched on before, just at the very outset, thinking through all the ramifications of what might go wrong. Because obviously at this point, if you're going to have to disclose that effectively your proprietary information is no longer proprietary, from a reputation management point of view, that's not going to be ideal.
So with all of this unfolding, Janet, Lynne, what sort of thoughts would you have on how you deal with communications?
I think this is one of those scenarios where I think James alluded to it. On the surface, it looks quite straightforward, but actually the complexity of the stakeholder map here and the stakeholder landscape is potentially enormous and can have many knock-on impacts. And this is where really fully understanding all of all of those relationships and all of those people and aligning all of those parties is a big challenge. And that's something that, again, preparation can really, really help you kind of, get up to speed really quickly. And I think then there are some, in my mind, some particular nuances around the fact that, we're talking here around China. It's thinking about, what do you have, if you're based in the UK, do you have someone who speaks Chinese, Mandarin, whichever version of is it simple Chinese, whichever? Yeah. Can you actually translate clearly and quickly what it is that's being said? Think about, when you are working in different countries, how do you understand the translation issue? Do you understand the local channels that are used to communicate over in the various countries? Can you monitor those channels? As a communications person, you always want to be able to know what's being said and keep ahead of the game, but also know what the channels are that are used. So is there a particular way in which one communicates in that local region that you need to have somebody on the ground locally that can monitor and check and watch out for you? Because I think this is where suddenly in these scenarios, it can become just on the surface quite expensive if you've got to start to engage sort of lots of media monitoring agencies and local language translation to be able to fully understand the picture. Janet, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to add to that. I mean, I think in addition to that media monitoring, essentially, and the media doesn't work the same way in China, and that's why having that local knowledge, not just the language, but the local knowledge, it was one of the advantages of either being a big organization with people within different countries, or to be able to access through potentially an agency where they have people in those countries, understanding what that nuance is about, because a lot of this will be influenced by the culture of the different country and how that's communicated and how that's thought of. I think, Lynne, when you and I were talking about this initially, it's one of those where we just went, this is the sort of thing that we hope and pray doesn't actually go into the media, that is just kept beneath the surface, because actually it's a supplier arrangement. Hopefully one isn't really thinking that's a big news hook and something to interest the media. But let's be honest, if there's a juicy story in it, the media will go after it. So it's about thinking through what might be that juicy story and how it might be killed or made less interesting.
So are there steps that you... Yeah, go on, Lynne, sorry, carry on.
So I was going to say, I'm just going to say that, Janet's absolutely right. And, the minute there's anything to do with supplier, but IP and the IP sort of going adrift, I guess, as I would just term it in China, is a name. Oh, people are always watching out for that. There is a media interest in that. In the same way, if it was located in India, can we actually work, and control our IP. And I guess it's a question for Mark and James around the security of your IP when you're going to various different countries.
I was going to come off mute. Yes, absolutely. I think it's thinking around your IP strategy and what information is. So you've got your IP registration strategy, and clearly you are going to look to within your own budgetary means in terms of actually what that registered patent portfolio looks like. But then it's actually sort of breaking that down from a partner perspective and really sense checking right at the outset in terms of what information does and doesn't need to be shared in order to sort of mitigate this kind of issue. And I think it's really been very, very clear on that from day one. I mean, IP obviously comes in multi. You've got registered IP, but actually increasingly you've got your softer IP nowadays with your data, with your technical information. You're not registered protecting that. You're seeking to protect that through the contracts you have and also measures you have around information security and the like. So thinking around your IP strategy around your partnering agreements right at the outset is going to be absolutely key.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, James, as well, is thinking as well about the enforcement strategy as well. If something does go wrong, effectively having that plan in place before actually entering into the agreement, just so that everybody knows what your commercial team can then work with legal to work out what is the risk and effectively try and price that risk into the contract.
So there's a question. Sorry, just going to raise a question about whether there are steps you can take to try and quieten down something that looks like it's building as a potential story, a disclosure of some kind. I mean, are there things you can do to proactively sort of preempt the disclosure and just calm down any kind of excitement around it? I wonder, Lynne, Janet, if you have anything to say on that.
I think you can always, if you have a clear, concise story, you can go out and you can proactively brief media that you believe may be interested in such a story. However, that doesn't give you any guarantee that they won't go ahead and print the story as they see the story, because you don't know what other sources they have on what's going on. So you can absolutely try to proactively put your side of the story out there, but that doesn't guarantee at all, does it, Janet, that they will go with what you say?
Definitely not. I think keeping in mind a journalist is after a great story. They want the byline out there, etc. It doesn't matter how wonderful your relationship may be with that journalist. I think if they see a brilliant story, they will go after it. And as you say, Lynne, it's difficult to know. And almost by raising the issue, sometimes they've got amazing nerves, or they just sensors. If they sense a story, they will go after it, and you're not going to be their only source. So I think it is about understanding the media environment, what's been written about before, because that's why you've got a comms team. They will know what's of interest to the media, what are some of the rumors around there. There are some legal sides of it, and I'll hand across to Mark and James on that one. I'm always questioning how effective they are, but you guys may have a different perspective on that one.
I think just in terms of sort of that external comms piece, I think from a litigator's perspective, my advice to clients is always try and not engage with the press, because I'm thinking of this from a court process in terms of anything which is going out in the public domain. But we appreciate that you have, from a commercial point of view, you have to engage with the press. And so we sort of work with communications teams in order to try and sort of at least deliver a message which helps the client in terms of their sort of commercial objectives in the short term, whilst not potentially prejudicing the position within the legal case. I think Janet and Lynne, as a question actually for you, is that I always find that sort of journalists, when they contact you for, for comments on an article, they always give you about 2 hours notice and say that this will be published at about 4 p.m. Is there any way to sort of manage that?
It's generally on a Friday as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Always when you've got like 20 other things you're addressing at the same time. It's a tough one, and it's one that we really, really wish there was more time for, and that's why, preparation is so important. But yeah, oh, sorry, that's my dog. Sorry about that. But yeah, I think that the key thing is, if you have a relationship with the media, it can help you in that they'll know how to get hold of you more quickly, and that may give you an extra half an hour or an extra hour. But when we shout and say, hey, we need it now, we need it now.
Quite frequently. Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Some of them you might have picked up, your comms team might have picked up that people are asking questions about things. It's one of the reasons to have that network. But yeah, sometimes it just comes out of a bolt out of the blue. And no, I'm really sorry, there is absolutely no way to stop them doing that. They do it deliberately, you know that.
Yes.
That's great. Well, in the interest of time, I think maybe we should have a look at some questions that have come in, unless there's anything else anyone wants to say about the case study. So I will just raise a couple of these questions before we go to the final closing remarks. So there's one here for Lynne. Can you comment something about how social media has changed things during the course of your career? If you could, either of you, say anything about that, would be great.
Sure. When you said at the opener that, I've been in the industry for like 25 plus years, it's like, yes. So definitely predates social media. And remember, all of the excitement as it, came along. And it was really interesting to see how some people shied away from social media and other people engaged with it. And some just didn't really know what to do with it. And I think therein was the real challenge. And, we live in a world where social media is there. You can't deny it exists. It's happening. It means that communications and information gets out really, really, really quickly. So you have to be engaging with those platforms, and you really have to know what's going on. And I think that the key thing that we have been doing a lot with, from a comms perspective, with different stakeholders across the different organizations that we work for, is really demystifying what social media is all about. Yeah, helping people understand it, because there's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of people are scared of it because they just don't really understand it. And then educating, and we're talking about C-suite, we're talking about internal, say BD, or even legal, understanding how these platforms work and what you can do with them and what you can't do with them, and understand the timeframes in which they operate. Yeah. And then really sort of like helping people come up with a strategy for how to use the channels, because they are a key part of your reputation building arsenal. And, and you can also get direct engagement with your customers, be it a B2B or a B2C scenario there. So they can be hugely, hugely valuable. But that means in a crisis, you also can use them to connect with certain people. If you've got, say, someone out there, say, a customer, no matter what they might be, potentially saying something negative about you, you can one, you see that really quickly, but two, you can connect with them and you can engage with them offline. And you can often diffuse a situation then by a really, really good offline engagement. And then you can get them to proactively go out there and say, hey, you know what? I had a problem with this particular company, but they worked with me, they've solved it, and hey, isn't that great? And so, they raise an issue, but they also show then what a great provider of a solution that you can be. So I think the key thing, if I were to not ramble on for hours about this, but it's really around social media can be very, very valuable, but really understand it and know how to use it, and just remember it's part of your arsenal. Janet, is there anything else I've missed that we should add?
I was just going to add to that, is it's also an excellent source of stories for journalists. So, which is why it's quite important to monitor the social media, understand what's going on, and being seen as the organization to be responsive to it. Because you can bet if you're not responsive and there's been something that's really stimulated the conversation, it's not unknown for a journalist to give you a call and say, I've seen this breaking, or I've seen that. So it is a great tool for you to get your messages out, rather than in the olden days when Lynne and I first started, you basically only had the media and you hoped that they picked your messages up. But on the other side, it is a chance to reveal, or for others to share when they're not particularly happy with you. So a reputation channel, and one in which you need to monitor and think about how you manage it.
Yeah, I was just going to touch on there, Janet and Lynne, that what I've also found with sort of social media as well, especially sort of Twitter, that actually the footprint, it has a long-standing footprint, which, given the way that it ranks within various search engines, including Google, it can actually stay within the the top couple of pages for quite a while. And I've worked in the past with external specialists who effectively managed your what they call SEO, search engine optimization, to try and push down the negative content. So apparently sort of people don't tend to go past the second or third page of Google. So to at least make sure that it's within the fifth, sixth, seventh page on Google, to try and effectively make sure that people aren't coming across that content, in a year's time or what have you.
Absolutely. And you could do that with media as well, because if you search for media headlines and you've had a number of negative media headlines, then you think about what is the strategy that you're going to do to get better positive stories up higher on there, because it tends to be date related. So yes, absolutely.
And I think you also highlight a point around, you do have other channels available to you, for example, your website. And you can actually start to, recognize those issues and then move the story on past those issues. Because I think, trust is built on honesty and transparency. And so if you're honest and transparent about, say, an issue, but it's been addressed and moved on, think very carefully about how you can move your corporate narrative through that process and build on for the future.
Thanks, that's great. There's just there isn't really time for any more than one question. Just looking here, James, do people think enough about what can go wrong in this sort of area when they're negotiating their commercial agreements?
Probably not, but there's an awful lot you can be thinking through when we've talked about some of those issues. So, for example, creating a forum within the contract governance structure for this free flow of information between the biotech and pharma business, or with key suppliers. So it's thinking around that, as Mark said, actually is getting the dispute escalation and dispute resolution processes right within the contract, thinking around termination rights and handback and confidentiality, etc. So it's having at the back of your mind actually what can potentially happen in the future, because a lot of the partnering agreements, as we all know, they are very, very long term in nature. They'll continue for the duration of the IP rights as well, and similarly on the supplier and management side. So it's thinking around that, but also how individual agreements then interconnect with everything else within the supply chain, so you're able to holistically look at actually where those other impacts are.
And I guess not putting the agreement in a drawer and forgetting about it, but
absolutely
putting those collaboration processes into effect.
Contract summaries are enormously useful in terms of being very, very clear and to trickle that within the organisation so everyone knows in terms of what those obligations are.
Thanks so much for coming.